Tonight's talk. Oh, super. Now to tonight's talk, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Darroch Bratt. Darroch, after an undergraduate at Aberdeen and an M.Lit at UHI, Darroch won a funded place to start a PhD in the archaeology department. This was in 2017. I got to join his supervision team, which was great because I got to learn lots about smuggling and whisky distillation that I didn't know about. Darroch got to develop a personal interest of his, whisky, into an academic study. Living the dream, eh? And he completed, a couple of years ago now, was it? Was it 2021?
2022. Oh, well, it wasn't that quick.
2022. Well done, yeah.
Actually, I only graduated on Friday.
Oh, terrific. Yeah. Congratulations again. And Darroch's going to talk to us tonight about the history and archaeology of illicit distillation and smuggling from three perspectives. The perspective of the men and women who work the stills. Secondly, from the perspective of the excisemen, who were expected to enforce flawed legislation. And thirdly, from the perspective of the landlords. So please welcome tonight Darroch, who will speak to us on Spare a Thought for the Exciseman, looking at the social world of whisky smuggling. Take it away, Darroch.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint, which hopefully will... Can everyone see that? And is it full screen? Great, cool. Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me to this. It's really, it's nice to do it now that the whole process is done. So it feels very satisfying to be invited to give this, and it's really good to see loads of names I recognize in the group. So yeah, I'm very flattered and happy to be here. So my thesis really concentrated on a quite wide-ranging historical archaeology of distilling, and through the whole process I grappled with the fact that the bit of it that everyone finds the most interesting is the smuggling and illicit distilling, and it's very much the bit that I found most interesting as well. So it was often quite hard to concentrate on anything else because it's such a fun bit of the history. But it's also a really serious bit of the history. Smuggling, it became clear, and the distilling of illicit spirits was highly significant both economically and socially, and it was happening in a very specific context of economic and social change in the Highlands in the 18th and 19th century. We often look at this as a sort of quite a romantic thing, and I'm going to try and be a little bit controversial and say at the end of this that I quite like the romance when it comes to illicit distilling. I think it tells us some things that are actually quite important. So yeah, before I launch into it, I'm just going to give you a very, very brief history of distilling in the Highlands and Islands. And I will try and keep this very short. So our first written reference to distillation is from the late 15th century in 1494, and that's from Fife. We've got less than a century later quite widespread distilling in Inverness, and it's happening there as a commercial activity. So people are making whiskey at home, and they are selling it as an add-on to the domestic economy. It's not necessarily just happening in towns. It seems to happen, at least by the 18th century, in more rural contexts, and the fairly widespread nature of commercial small-scale distilling is mentioned in the forfeited estate papers for Lovat estates and so on like that. So it's a fairly widespread practice, and people are exercising it throughout the Highlands and Islands, and it's a part of their economy. From the mid-17th century, there were nationally imposed taxes on making whiskey. So not just buying it. We pay taxes when we buy whiskey, but it's also when it's being made. So it was excisable. It was an excisable good. And that was brought in the 1640s, and there was a range of legislative changes through the 18th century, which I could go on for quite a long time about, but I will spare you it. But the one that's really, really important for us just now is the introduction of the Highland Line, and not the abolishment of distilling in the Highlands and Islands, but north of the Highland Line, it became very difficult to distill on a small scale legally. And this presented a problem because it was a big part of people's economy, and times were relatively hard. People found it necessary to keep distilling. For what is quite important for this talk is that there was a romance that has become this has come to be seen as quite romantic period of our history, and things to do with smugglers often are smugglers and pirates and all these things. These are bits of our history that become quite romanticized. And even at the time, we'll see that there were romantic notions of the Highlands and Highlanders and Highlandism that were being employed by all the groups involved. So, risking being very simplistic, I have broken this down into a series of groups of people. And almost like a play, we've got the distillers, we've got the smugglers, we've got the gaugers or excisemen, and we've got the landlords. And then we've got various other people who often come into the historical record. So people related to the Kirk sessions, travelers writing memoirs and travelers' accounts, and other commentators. These voices are not equally represented in the historical record, it has to be said. It's incredibly difficult to find an actual distiller talking about a night at a distilling site. It's really, really hard to find. I have found it, and we'll go into it later. But for every one distiller talking, you've got hundreds of commentators and landlords and politicians. And that's also where the archaeology becomes quite an important resource for us to understand what distilling was as a practice and what it meant to people. It's worth just very briefly looking at this illustration on the right side of the screen here. We see, men, women, and children all involved in this process. And we also see, this is from a 19th century representation that was printed in a newspaper. We see how the exciseman there is in the middle is quite an aggressive figure. And you've got people there destroying the things that are being used to make whiskey.
Recorded.
Okay, so these were there were a variety of roles occupied, and I'm also going to stress just now that these are not that clearly defined. Sometimes smugglers and distillers could be the same people, but also these were these were interdependent relationships a lot of the time, and we'll talk about that more as well. So I think this is an absolutely fantastic romantic picture because it shows us a lot about how the 19th century perception of smuggling was sort of constructed. Here we've got a very muscular, masculine looking Highlander in his Highland dress at a whiskey still. We've got the dogs at his feet, and we've got the women and the children all looking adoringly towards him. And it's not necessarily representing a reality. So this is one of the very popular images that we'll often see in books and articles about illicit distilling. So what sort of occupation was this? Essentially, people were distilling because they had already been doing it. They weren't necessarily engaging in this for the first time when it was an illicit activity. And it's quite likely, and a lot of the voices in the historical record seem to suggest that people felt they were exercising a right that had been alienated from them. But it's ambiguous. Commentators also know that there is a sort of degree of moral danger. This is often described in terms of it frustrating and getting in the way of schemes of improvement. So we're talking about this happening in the late 18th century and the 19th century, when the Highlands are being changed and rationalized, and people are developing economies. And in fact, there are some really fantastic articles written by an anonymous Rossshire gentleman talking about how nobody working his fields gets any work done because they're all so tired from spending the night in the distilling bothy. But you also sometimes find sympathy with this. So it's this amazing economic activity, but it's affecting people from all areas and walks of life. As an activity, we can see when we look at the distilling sites and combine our knowledge of the sites with some of the documentation that this is economically a really important activity. From Strathconnan, we have Gauger's records talking about finding 200 gallons of wash at a single site. By modern methods, that's enough to make 100 bottles of whiskey. And we often see in depictions of smugglers whiskey being transported in anchors, which are 37 litres, and with at least 2 anchors being put over the back of a pony. There are usually multiple ponies in these descriptions and pictures. So we're really talking about quite a lot of spirit being produced. So that's an argument for how economically important it is that this is an activity. It's also important to realize that the people making that whiskey didn't necessarily keep all of that money. So they would often be selling that to smugglers who would then take it on and sell it for a profit. So they weren't necessarily making all that much money, and often where people were persisting in areas distilling, the rents were going up. So at the end of the 19th century, we have the Napier Commission actually saying one of the reasons that rents remained so high on Lewis was that they'd never come back down from the peak of distilling. The locations and the landscape are really important. So this picture on the right, it shows two things. One, that you can sort of see shealing grounds off in the distance there, and often these sites are near shealing grounds or other areas that we might consider Utmark, or so that they're outside of townships and farmsteads, and they're often in shealing grounds where the shealing practice is declining or has stopped. So you'll often find a distilling site in fairly good condition near a shealing ground where the shealings are not in good condition. So there's perhaps a social significance there of people going to the shealing grounds and maintaining that sort of social aspect of distilling in an area of landscape that they feel alienated from. But it's also an expeditious area of the landscape. It's near routes. This one, in fact, this bit of landscape in this picture, one of the Strathconnan is from, it's actually right on one of the main routes from east to west. So it's a convenient landscape as well. And also for context, although you can't see them in that picture, there are 4 illicit stills. So that they're well hidden. That one of them's right in the center of the picture, but it's a activity that's happening on quite a scale there. There's also a variety in the form of the sites. So on the left there is a drawing, not very good drawing by myself, of a distilling bothy and how it was laid out. So a small hearth in a corner, a small dip in the wall for conducting fresh water in for the distilling process. But that's that's actually a fairly substantial distilling bothy. These ones in Strathconnan are about as substantial as I've seen, and they get a lot more ephemeral. So we've got on the left here is what I've come to think of as a wash shelter, a small shelter. These are described in various letters from the 19th century as just a place to mature wash, to protect wash as it ferments, with distilling then being done outside in the open air. On the right there is a little sketch by Landseer of a small hearth being set up. And yeah, these romantic depictions we always treat with a little bit of caution, although there is also archaeological reasons to see these. So on the left there is a small hearth found near Applecross a couple of years ago, and on the right is a rather good sketch of a small little hearth built in a cave near Cuig on the west coast. Um, these are always slightly ambiguous sites. So a hearth, often associated with distilling, could be for other things, and I think it's important when you talk about the archaeology of distilling to acknowledge that some of it is quite ambiguous. So although I think these probably are distilling sites, they could have they could have multiple functions. So you get this huge sort of variability in the archaeology that is related to distilling, from these small hearths to little burnside platforms to fairly well constructed formal bothies. It's happening on a variety of scales. But what's really interesting about the sites is what they meant to people. So we've talked about the scale of the production, and that's great. But they're also seen as fostering endemic disorder. And there's a really good sort of panicky line in one of the bits of legislation about how the defiance of laws in the Highlands was approaching the scale of Ireland because of illicit distilling. So it's seen as a way for people were frustrating laws, frustrating the state, and frustrating the wishes and designs of landowners, and that's often how it was talked about, especially in Parliament. We've got loads and loads of great records of evidence given to Parliament in the formation of laws. There's also a aspect of this where we know this was an activity that people of different genders participated in, and that was seen as suspicious in itself. So that there's in the Kirk session for the Cabrach, there's quite a few references, I think 2 or 3 references to people being suspected of fornication, because they're men and women going to the brew houses on their own late at night, likely to just be people, checking on washer or checking in with friends distilling, but it was seen as suspect. The very nature of this as a practice, it sort of entailed secrecy. So you weren't going up to the distilling site and telling absolutely everyone about it. So there's a lot of distrust that could come about from this, especially because you were doing this in contravention of rules and laws, and you were trying to avoid paying taxes. So that's the whole point of it. There was also elements of the laws that were suppressing distillation that were targeted at specific communities. So in 1799, there was evidence from an Isla landowner talking about how this was actually a really good opportunity to lock up lots of travellers, people from the travelling community, because they were coming over from Ireland to fit up stills for people, and in their opinion, that was a good sort of excuse to incarcerate people. I think the quote was, "Society will be all the happier for it." So you see these other prejudices coming out. There are also some really quite bizarre romantic descriptions of nights at distilling sites that are written by Victorian travellers later in the 19th century that talk about like men wearing dresses and acting as women at distilling sites. Very difficult to decipher and try to work out the historical significance of it. But it's possible people dressed as women to avoid identification or something like that. But often, you're working with fairly ambiguous sources here, and romanticization does really affect the material that we work with. The best source for describing a night at a distilling bothy actually comes from a murder investigation, precognitions taken after a murder in Strathconnell in 1835, and it's a really interesting set of precognitions, because there's one person who's been accused of the murder who gives a completely different account to everyone else, because their defense rested on the the young man who died being, really really drunk, and his injuries. He appears to have been bludgeoned to death, and his argument was that his injuries were from him falling repeatedly and stumbling down the hillside and into bogs and so on. The other five precognitions from that case all agreed about what had been happening at the distilling site that night, and it was really, really interesting. Partly because it seems like a really nice night. It's very sociable. There are a mix of ages present, with the oldest person being in their 60s and the youngest being 16. There are at least 2 women present in the night, and there are 3 men. And visitors. So one of the things that's really interesting is that people bring food throughout the night, and people bringing them food also inform them about the presence of gaugers in the community. So there's a lot of communication going on at this site with people in the township. And because of the work of Nosas, we actually know exactly which township and where the hut was. It's in a similar position to this one here, but unfortunately didn't have a picture of the other site. So that's really interesting. So they're being brought cheese and bread, and it seems to be a very sociable night. But also interestingly, they don't appear to be drinking that much. So one of the criticisms that's leveled at this at the people who are distilling whiskey illegally is that they're all drunk and disorderly. But in this precognition, they appear to have a couple of glasses of whiskey between them, or a couple of cups of whiskey between them, and not much more, which sort of makes sense, because if you're making something to sell and it's important to your economic life, then you're not going to drink it all. And you also want to be aware of the approach of excisemen and gaugers, so it makes sense not to be too drunk. So it's a really, really interesting insight into what seemed to be a normal night at a distilling site, except sadly someone ended up dying. So it's a fantastic example, but sadly, as a bit of evidence, although it appears to describe a normal night at a distilling site, it's not normal. It's highly charged emotionally, and it's people's sort of freedom are sort of contingent on that evidence. A fantastic bit of evidence, nonetheless. The next group of people to discuss are the smugglers, and again, I'm shamelessly using a fairly cheeky romantic depiction of some smugglers here from Ralph Steadman's book. So you can start by sort of dividing the smugglers into 2 groups of people from the get-go. The first are professional smugglers, and historically they're really hard to pin down, because if you've left a paper trail, you're probably not a very good smuggler. So we've got various bits of evidence from people who discuss the smugglers. Some discuss them as regularly trained smugglers, often from Ireland. And again, that's something that comes out of parliamentary records. It's likely that their business model was similar to that of the drovers, that they bought whiskey at the site and then sold it on. But then there's another group of people, and evidence from the Cabaret talks about women, cottagers, and small folk being the primary smugglers of whiskey. It also, interestingly, when this is parliamentary evidence, a lot of it focuses on risk. So, especially women being expected to take a lot of the risk, because it's when you're smuggling whiskey that you're, very likely to be caught. You're going to be traveling to a busy place. You're going to be carrying stuff, and the risks of smuggling were really real and palpable. So not only was there the risk of getting caught and having material confiscated, there's plenty of evidence of violence and murder. And then some things that are slightly, in some ways actually more troubling. So a lot of people did smuggle by boat, and in Woodbine Parish's discussion of the excise laws, and this is a man who was defending the use of excise laws that were very prohibitive of distilling. And this is 1816, so before distilling laws were relaxed and the Highland Line was abolished. He talks about one of the defences for having such a frankly crap system of excise enforcement was that they were able to press gang the people caught smuggling in boats. So he talks about, I think it was the Firth of Lorne, and apprehending 16 to 18 stout fellows and taking them immediately aboard a man of war, and that this was a really good way to recruit and press gang people for the navy. Again, there's a romantic sort of tradition associated with smuggling, and these are often comes from historical accounts, but they seem to be quite celebratory, and they celebrate cheekiness. There's a very characteristic tale of a woman in a breakin that comes from an old exciseman's memoir, who was apprehended on the road from a break-in into Inverness and forced to hand over her whiskey. And as she was being forced to hand over her whiskey, she says, "Oh, I'm so tired, I'm so thirsty. Just let me have a single sip of my whiskey before I hand it to you and see it all smashed." At which point she takes a sip and spits this spirit into the exciseman's eyes and manages to make good her escape. So these are really quite sort of common tales. Another one that is similarly celebrates cheekiness comes from the Bogroy Inn, where several gaugers after an expedition into Strathglass return to the Bogroy Inn, which people who frequently travel to Inverness will know where that is, just near Kirkhill. And when they come back to the inn, they get this poor girl who's working there to take the cask of confiscated whiskey upstairs into their room, and the gauges all sit around in their room in the evening, very relaxed and smug, while the girl, having taken note of exactly where she put the cask of whiskey, allows the smugglers to come in and drill a hole under the cask and drain it into a waiting receptacle below, which I'm not sure is physically possible, and I expect the gauges would have heard the thumping of a barrel emptying in their room. But it's completely indicative of the way that people really celebrate this sort of like cheeky, subversive history. But there is also evidence of romance being used in the 19th century. And Stuart of Garth, who wrote a series of essays on life in the Highlands, spoke about smugglers really mobilizing Highland identity and drumming into towns, not just to advertise the fact that they brought their whiskey in, but to just humiliate the excisemen and draw a big crowd, and they'd be in their Highland dress and so. Again, it's hard to know if these are true, but these stories tell us a lot about how it's remembered. So this is, I think, a really useful quote here. That tells us a lot about how, in reality, whiskey seems to have been, whiskey distilling seems to have actually functioned as a social thing. And again, it's more about people exercising an alienated right and relying on each other in difficult social and economic times, and not necessarily seeing these things as morally that complex. It's this is a really great quote: "Not perceiving any moral turpitude," and then people being easily reconciled to infraction of this law's provisions. And perhaps the most telling thing here: persons who would not commit an act of dishonesty in the private intercourse of their life would be too ready to deem it no sin to cheat the king, and hence smuggling, with all of its evil consequences, is engendered and encouraged. So this is another quote from Stuart of Garth, and it's all about how people are not really seeing this as morally a bad thing, and really that it was laws that were at fault. So far, what we've seen is that this is a largely celebrated folk tradition. I will go on to talk about how it's been encouraged in some ways by landlords. But before I do that, I just want to quickly talk about one really telling incident in the Compton Kirk session. And this tells us a little bit about how the money how people had money from smuggling. Well, when other people didn't necessarily have any money. And in so this is from 1801, and at one, pardon me. So in 1801, when people were awaiting the distribution of the church's funds for the poor, the funds actually came up short. And although the landowner contributed a hefty sum, there still wasn't enough. So there's a little note written in the Kirk session, apparently quite a long time after the original entry, and it's the only bit that seems to have been written not in ink. And it says, "At this time, I managed to get £1 from a smuggler, threatening to inform on him if he didn't give this money for the poor." So I think it's a really interesting thing that this presumably elder knew who the smugglers were and knew who had the money and saw them as fair game, and didn't seem to have any sort of hesitation to take that money, but still sort of felt guilty about it, and felt it necessary to record the Kirk session. I just think it's fantastic. And I think arguably the most interesting bunch of people in this story are the excise people. They're tasked with collecting duties and enforcing laws imposed on illicit distilling, and collecting duties on a range of other goods. So, like salt was a very major one, and often they're seen as the villain of the story of illicit distilling. So, especially in fiction, you'll see these people as plodding, unimaginative, easily outwitted by resourceful smugglers, or as cruel and vindictive, relentless and corrupt. But these are all kind of pastiches. They were working in very dangerous conditions. They were not all that well paid, and they paid for a lot of expenses out of their own pockets, including having to hire help and muscle and people to help them confront distillers and smugglers. So there's a lot of physical confrontation. It's not necessarily that well remunerated, and they're often often in quite dire straits. There's a report to the government in 1789 that noted, by the present law, an excise officer has a fixed salary on which he can scarcely live, and if he endeavour to seize an unlicensed still, he is certain to be put to the trouble and expense, and perhaps to get maimed. So yeah, they're in the grand scheme of things, their salary was not a dreadful one, but it didn't go all that far. Essentially, they're often accused as well of being engaged in a little bit of skullduggery and taking bribes. Osgood Mackenzie, a sort of noted memoir from Osgood Mackenzie, described them retiring on blackmail pensions large enough to buy a southern street. So they're seen with some suspicion. But there are some really remarkable figures associated with work in the excise, and I'm not going to pretend for a moment to be an expert on any of them, but I just thought it's worth highlighting some of the individuals who have worked in the excise. Perhaps the most obvious of these is Robert Burns. So, known to absolutely everyone, known and associated with whiskey quite often, and actually wrote poems about the excise at some points, very rarely, well, never, in a favourable light. So in 1789, he secured himself a position within the excise service in Dumfriesshire, and he seemed aware at the outset of how unpopular this job would be. And he wrote a friend to Robert Ainsley, a friend of his, about this. And his motivation for joining appears to be purely pragmatic. So here's an excerpt from a letter. I know not how the word exciseman, or still more appropriate, gauger, will sound in your ears. I too have seen the day when my auditory nerves would have felt delicately on this very subject. But a wife and children are things which have a wonderful power in blunting these kind of sensations. £50 a year for life, and a provision for widows and orphans you will allow is not a bad settlement for a poet. So those prejudices against the gauges that he'd held were probably quite well summed up in a poem he'd written just a few years earlier. I believe it was Scotland's earnest cry, the author's earnest cry and prayer, and it was about the Wash Act, which prevented people distilling. Paint Scotland greeting over her thistle, her muchkin stout as tones a whistle, and damned exciseman in a bustle season a stell, triumphant crushing it like a mussel or lamp shell. Then on the other hand present her a blackguard smuggler right behind her, and cheek for chow a chuffy vintner, collegan join, picking her pouch as bare as winter, oh a kind of coin. So he's fully aware of how people perceive the excisemen, and he doesn't seem to hold them in that high esteem himself. But the salary was better than he would otherwise expect to get. There's a really great article on Burns and the excise by Jared Carruthers, and Carruthers really stresses that Burns seemed to really actually enjoy his job as an exciseman, and part of that might have been because of the way he saw himself. And it's a really interesting thing about the excise, but it sort of makes sense. These were people who were engaged in collecting taxes, and they had ideas about how they should be spent and what a modern country looked like. So he might have seen that it's morally acceptable to be following in the roles of other excisemen who were politically and economically very radical, and included names like Thomas Paine and James Thompson Callender, whose work Burns admired and knew very well. And I think he probably enjoyed seeing himself as part of that tradition. Another person who, again, I wish I was more expert on, I'm certainly not, is John Murdoch. So he worked as an exciseman in Kilsyth, Lancaster, in Ireland, and ran in the late 19th century the Highlander newspaper from Inverness. And this focused on injustices, particularly in land ownership, and it promoted Gaelic culture. And the paper was constantly sued by landowners, and it was shut down after 9 years. Murdoch refused to follow a career in Parliament, but he was instrumental in setting up the Scottish Labour Party and convincing Keir Hardie to run for Parliament, becoming the first Labour MP. He founded the Scottish Land Restoration League, and this was is the movement that was instrumental in resulting in the Napier Commission, which ultimately led to better rights for crofters and better security. He's also, I think this is a really interesting thing to note, that excisemen are often seen as coercive characters, and a lot of the stories around them revolve around violence. But John Murdoch recollected, "I had been a strict peace man for 40 years, and never, even in putting down smuggling, resorted to offensive or even defensive weapons." So yeah, a really eminent figure in Highland history, and according to Jim Hunter, the man to whom, more than anyone else, there belongs the credit for arousing the crofting community to a sense of its own potential. Another well-known exciseman, Alexander Carmichael. He was an exciseman and a folklorist, and he collected folk traditions from around Scotland and the Highlands, and published them in the 2-volume Carmina Gadelica, which is a collection of stories, charms, hymns, prayers. It's an amazing resource for historians. So, again, we'll often see excisemen as a sort of a sneering figure, but we have people like John Murdoch and Alexander Carmichael who are deeply, deeply attached to Gallic culture and want to preserve it and represent it. So they're not simple figures, and they don't necessarily fit simply into our vision of an exciseman. The fourth figure I'd like to talk about really. He's absolutely fascinating and very complicated. An Aberdeenshire gauger called Malcolm Gillespie, who in some ways probably fits more into the traditional view of gaugers. He had a reputation as incredibly diligent and brutal, especially to women. He employed a group of heavies, essentially of mercenaries, I suppose, who he described as not the best of characters, and he was well known for patrolling the roads of Aberdeenshire with a pit bull, which was actually killed in an altercation with smugglers. But he was extremely successful in apprehending several smugglers, and it's because of his trial papers that we know of some of the smugglers from the Cabrach. But he was, as we've already talked about, he was paying for a lot of these expenses out of his pocket, and because of these expenses, he resorted, along with his assistant, to forging bills, which he was eventually caught doing, convicted, and hung, as well as his assistant George Skene Edwards. So he sort of completely encapsulates that predicament that a lot of gaugers were in, that they were doing a dangerous job for insufficient money. Finally, we'll talk about the landlords. That's actually a picture from this week's Tory Party conference. This is a really interesting group of people, and they hold perhaps the most contradictory role in the history of distilling. Early on in the 17th century, lots of landlords seem to be encouraging distilling, including people like the Forbes of Culloden, who made the Farintosh distilling operation in the Black Isle incredibly popular and incredibly successful. We have other estates as well at the same time. As early as the 1670s, the Mackenzies of Tarbet had many people distilling on their lands, it would appear. They're also enthusiastic consumers. There's some great evidence from the 1730s of the amount of alcohol being consumed at sort of landed gentry gatherings and parties, including the Forbes in Inverness, where people were expected to have a pint of champagne before stepping over the threshold. Really quite enthusiastic consumers of alcohol. But that alcohol seems to have included whiskey, even in the 18th century. Where their social role really overlaps with whiskey and illicit distilling is in that in the early 19th century and late 18th century, the landlords were really needing to retain populations on their estates. So their political and economic power came from being able to raise a lot of money in rent, and their military power came from being able to recruit people for the armed forces. So one of the ways that they were able to keep people on their estates rather than driving everyone off for sheep, as happened later in the 19th century, was that they allowed distilling to happen. And this figure of 3 times the rent for people who were illicit distilling comes up repeatedly in different bits of evidence to Parliament and memoirs and so on. So that's certainly a really important aspect of their role. Importantly, the landowner was often the justice of the peace. So if you were caught distilling or smuggling and apprehended, the person you were facing was ultimately often your landlord, who had a vested interest in making sure that you can still pay your rent. There's a really quite incredible set of Justice of the Peace records from Invermoriston, where two illicit distillers really badly maim a gauger who apprehends them when they're distilling illicitly by striking him in the head with an axe, and they um, had quite a large trial, it would seem, from the amount of paperwork, but paid a sixpence fine, which was paid by the landlord, and spent a total of 6 hours in the toll booth. So they got off pretty much scot free. There are plenty of individual landowners that can be discussed, and this is where the iniquity and the sort of historical evidence comes in, because we've got loads and loads of evidence from different landlords talking about the best ways to suppress distillation, the best ways to design laws, because a lot of these people were also MPs or had business interests that meant they were invited to help define these laws and design them. But they're still, as we talked about in the last slide, still sort of interdependent with the distillers and the smugglers. They don't want them to just be crushed and stop being able to pay their rents. So a really interesting figure here is George Mackenzie of Cool, who owned Strathconnell and areas of the west coast, including Inverloch and Balblair. So one of the most interesting bits of evidence that's given to Parliament is the way George Mackenzie suggests that illicit distilling should be suppressed. And it's that people, the excise people and the people from revenue cutters should be concentrating only on the roads and not hunting for illicit distillers in the hills. And that there are points on the roads where they can apprehend smugglers most easily. Makes a lot of sense if you're suppressing smugglers, but crucially, if those smugglers had been buying whiskey at the distilling sites or at the townships, you're likely apprehending them after they've paid your tenants for their whiskey. So it might be a good way for George to make sure he's still going to receive his rents. We've also got telling evidence from Elizabeth Grant of Rothy Mercus, who supplied whiskey for King George's visit to Edinburgh, and it was illicit whiskey from Glenlivet, and it was kept by her own family in their cellar. And she talked about it very fondly, and she says it had been kept long in uncorked bottles, and it had the true contraband gout in it, which is a great expression. And I'm never sure if by gout she means that it's really indulgent, or if she means it's got that sort of gout of fire. I'm never quite sure. But it's a great description, and it was seen as a really great contribution. King George was able to show his sort of Highland tastes, and it was a very popular thing that he did when he came to Edinburgh, was drinking illicit whiskey. But it also secured for her father an Indian judgeship later in his life. So yeah, it was a good way to signal that connection with the Highlands. So we've talked about the three groups of people, and I just want to sort of finish by talking about the thing that really defines all these relationships is that there seems to be a degree of interdependence and a complexity of action and experience. So we do often talk about this in romantic terms, but we've got landowners who are dependent on rents from their tenants. We've got tenants who are facing really high rents from their landowners, and we've got excise people who might be open to taking bribes, or they might have real interests in the people in the Highlands and really want to represent them and do well by them. So it's a really complex set of characters, and this is all happening in the context of improvement and social change in the Highlands. So it's a complex practice, and these characters really help us look at the pardon me, these characters really help us understand a little bit more about how these changes were experienced in the Highlands and Islands. I'm wrapping up there, but I would really like to have questions if people have any.
Thank you very much, Darroch, for a very stimulating and wide-ranging talk. It was really interesting for me to revisit some of these things that you told me about in our years of supervision together, and to discover some new things as well. So I wonder, are there any questions immediately springing to folks' mind? Now, I think, Ian, are you wanting to chair the discussion?
Not especially, Abby, but I'll keep an eye on the chat. So if folks
Okay,
don't
great.
want to ask their question directly, I'll feed in from the chat.
Super. Anne, would you kick us off then?
It's not so much a question, it's just something that I heard at one point about it in relation to Arthur Carmichael and his collections, that the two informants he had in the Naas district of Lewis, for example, were two who were known to have an illicit still. So you kind of wonder, was it, you talked about bribery and corruption with him. Was it maybe, I will ignore the fact that you have a still if you give me a couple of stories or a few lines of verse or something that I can add to my collection? So it's it wasn't necessarily monetary reward that they were after, but depending on their own interests, I think maybe they made the job work for them in some ways.
Yeah, well, you kind of hope so, wouldn't you? It's a kind of a nice thing to believe, I think, and it may well be true. But yeah, I think he's a really interesting character that does show that these were people with like genuine interests and often genuine affection for the areas where they were posted. Interestingly, the excise people in Isla were constantly being shifted around because they kept getting quite fond of the locals. So he didn't want that. There's a question from Rona there. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I was going to avoid going into this in depth, but essentially, there were different regimes of taxation, and this was it was for a few reasons. It sort of starts with barley and the amount of tax you can levy on barley and malt, and essentially, the Highlands had always had quite a low tax on barley and malt because we don't produce very good barley and malt. But especially after the Union, this was seen as unfair, that Highlands were getting a preferential rate. There seems to have been quite a lot of like corporate lobbying, essentially. So there were big distilling companies in the south of Scotland in the 1780s, and they partly to justify their own domination of the English market, kept talking about how they had to sell in England because they were so threatened with the output of Highland stills. So one of the solutions to this was to create a line across which you could not take whiskey from the Highlands, and that line just meant that if you were producing whiskey up here, you had to sell it up here, usually within your own parish, although the actual stipulations of the Excise Act sort of changed repeatedly over time. But yeah, that was the reason that the Highland line was deeply significant. Teresa?
Thanks, Darroch. Thanks for the presentation. It was really fascinating. I was taking tons of notes as you went, so there were amazing moments throughout. And I just found your PhD online, so I'm super excited to read that.
It's less stilted than my own delivery, I promise.
Oh, it's great. It's great. And I guess I have kind of a bigger question, I think, because I'm teaching today, so I think that's where my head is at. Sometimes I think with the narratives in the Highlands and Islands, you had mentioned previously about a lot of that sort of romanticism of smuggling and romanticism of illicit distilling and all of that. And I suspect through your experience that you've just gone through, you have quite a different take on whiskey in general in the Highlands and Islands. And I'm very conscious of the fact that often we're reading secondary sources that are more maybe urban based or more central belt focused. And it's incumbent upon us to really try to uncover what was that real story and look through that sort of romantic lens to find out what was really going on. So this is kind of a big question. You can take it wherever you want, but I'm really wondering, like, what is it that you want all of us to go away with in terms of what is that, narrative of whiskey in the Highlands and Islands during the time period that you studied? What really is it that we should be aware of, looking at, focusing on?
Well, yeah, thank you for the easy question.
Sorry.
I think there are as many narratives as there were people engaged in distilling, and I mean there's a really good quote from Chris Dalglish about the role of like landowners and their tenants and people being unable to operate without reference to each other, even if they wanted to. So I think what I would take away from, if I was going to hold one opinion about the illicit distillers, it would be that people are pragmatic, that they exist within power structures and they have limited options at any time, and that people will draw on their own practical skills and they will refer to their cultural and historical understandings of themselves and their communities. Which is such a general thing to say that it sort of risks being banal, but I think that is really what the whole history of illicit distilling shows us, is that people are really quite practical. They will do what they can to get by, and that people will work together to do these things. I remember having a fairly apocalyptic lecture when I was at Aberdeen about climate change in the Bering Strait, and the way market changed to sort of meet new challenges. And the lecturer Rick Necht said something that always sort of stuck by me, and it was that when things were at their worst, he felt that people were at their most collaborative and were generally at their best. So it's quite a hopeful thing to say, but perhaps that's something you can sort of take away from this, is that people are really resourceful and will work together.
Thank you. Darroch, I was struck again by some of your comments on shieling sites. So, I have an interest in this. And I was just wondering, so you were saying that quite often the stills were found at shieling sites which have been relatively recently abandoned. And I was just wondering if, this is a bit beyond the remit of what you were trying to say, so sorry if you don't. Do we know why these shieling sites had been abandoned? Was it because, so I thought of two possible explanations. Was it because the people themselves were responding to a changing economy, probably to do with black cattle, like no longer got as much money from black cattle, so it made less sense to use those sites and so on and so forth, and they found a different use for them? Or was it that their access had been removed by landlords, which I know certainly happened in the Badenoch area that David Taylor has talked to? I just wondered this because you used an interesting phrase. You talked about that they were perhaps alienated from these shieling grounds, which suggests to me that they've been perhaps taken off them, alienated in that sense, because it struck me that people would actually feel very connected with their shieling sites, that they spent a lot of time in over multiple generations in the summer, and perhaps using the places as stills actually retained a connection. But anyway, I was just wondering if you knew anything, maybe particularly from your examples that you've looked at in depth, about what had happened with these shieling sites and why they've changed purpose.
I think it's probably both of those things. So some of the archaeological remains in Strathconnell are from the 1880s, like as late as that, of the distilling sites, and the shieling grounds appear to have been out of use for longer than that. one of the things that's interesting about Strathconnell, though, is that it's one of these places where there's been some really great research about where people's shooting grounds were, and in Strathconnell, it's quite a long way away sometimes. So people in the east of the Glen were actually going right beyond the west for their shooting grounds. But the sources that talk about that night at the distilling site have them up at a distilling site which is near a shieling ground, and it's only about 2 kilometers from their township. So we don't know if that's the shieling ground they were using for shielings, or they were just using it for distilling. Part of the reason for using these shieling sites, though, is that they're relatively accessible, that they are sited around, good access to water. That's a basic for livestock. So they're sort of expeditious sites to use. But I think there's probably an affection for the shieling ground, which is important. So it's a fairly sociable place, and I think that's probably quite a big motivating factor. Whether people were necessarily thinking about transhumance as a practice that was on the decline is harder to tell, especially with reference to any one site. But I think it's certainly possible, and of course, seasonally, it's opposite to the use of shielings. So for livestock, so you tend to distill in the winter after the harvest is brought in. So again, you're just sustaining that sociable space for as long as you can. But yeah, it's a really hard thing to know. Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Darroch. It's I really interesting talk and really interesting discussion there between yourself and Ebby, and I kind of like to link that discussion to something that Anne, I absolutely know will know far more about than myself. But I'm wondering about your sources, and in particular, I'm wondering about this really interesting relationship between the shieling grounds and illicit distilling. The one rising, the one falling, as you kind of depict it. And I'm just wondering, in terms of evidence, does that relationship get discussed, shall we say, or recorded in the poetry, for instance?
Not very reliably. You do have songs that sort of associate the distilling with livestock. So that a very well-known song was the Yowie with the Crooked Horn, which was about a still being destroyed, and it described it as a ewe. The sources are really hard to say. As I say, the methods of building the stills to me look different than the methods of building the shielings. So in Strathconnell, the shielings tend to be turf built with a sort of stone base, and the distilling sites almost always are stone, dry stone. There are turf distilling sites, though. There are some, and there are some in Strathconnell. So they could well be contemporaneous, but it's really hard to tell. The most of the evidence dates to from 1800 to 1830 for Strathconnell and a bit later. So it's hard to know basically what the state of transhumance was then. But yeah, it's you can sort of try and fit it into a general picture, but yeah.
Thanks, Darroch. And we've got another question on exactly this relationship from Siobhan there in the chat. Siobhan, I don't know whether you want to ask your question direct or whether you're happy for me to read it out. I'll ask it.
Hi there. Sorry, I've got a lot of background noise. That's why I dropped at the chat. No, it was just when you were saying about the difference in but using obviously the still sites as the disused shielings. I was wondering what the ratio is. Is there a good mix, or is you see that more often than not that they're disused shielings? And could that then be used within a kind of archaeological context? to then be able to date phases of different occupations through the sites.
Yeah, I mean the remains of the buildings just on the ground appear to be in far better condition than the shielings are. So the archaeology would suggest that the distilling sites post date the shieling sites. But there are perhaps reasons that you would build in stone, not least like having lots and lots of fire. So it's kind of hard to say. For Strathconnell, in particular, that there are sites that appear to date to the 1880s, and there's a couple on the south side of the Glen that we can pretty confidently sort of place them in excise reports to the 1880s, when that area of the Glen was not well populated, and a lot of people had been moved out to Strathpether. So there are reasons to think that that is after those shielings would have gone out of use.
Thanks, Gav. That's really useful. It was more I was thinking about in almost like our context with Emberlaw and seeing that different phasing within that, and that's really interesting. I don't think we've taken away the first time round when we were thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. Of course, these are sites that are often built right on burns and streams as well, which might influence how you build it. Your turf will be getting washed away more readily than your dry stone. So again, these are all factors that could be considered.
Really interesting point in the chat there from what would appear to be one of our students, Susan Dyke. Thank you very much there, Susan. Would you like me to read those out, or are you happy to join in the conversation yourself? Okay. that kind of explains it. So basically, for the recording, really, Susan is saying that in her own research, she's found some really interesting evidence, or in terms of barley cereal grain, when taxes were high on grain. Some really interesting evidence for Caithness area that ties in the demise of the shieling with clearances and indeed evidence for distilling. That might, Darroch, be a conversation that you and Susan could have subsequently, perhaps.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that more. And again, it's probably something I should have emphasized in the talk more. But there are lots and lots of sort of fluctuations in illicit distilling activity. It's not totally contingent on the Highland Line being there. That was abolished in 1816, and distilling sort of continued to spike every so often through the 19th century, and that does seem to be related to like times of stress and poverty. So like it comes and goes, but there's a big sustained endemic frenetic period of illicit distilling from like the 1780s to the 1920 to the 1820s rather, and from Rona. So there was still significant illicit distilling after the 1843 Act. Alternative date. So yeah, the 1823 was the Excise Act, and yes, it persisted, and it's again, it would be great to have lots of written things that described the rationale of smugglers and illicit distillers, but we don't really have them. But after 1823, it did persist, but it did seem to stop being such a priority for the excise, which is interesting, and perhaps that's because they're now raising enough levies in legal distillation. Plenty of people did go legit. So there were plenty of people who were willing to distill legally and were eager to take that chance. They didn't necessarily have the easiest time. Distilling is subject to lots of external pressures, the price of grain and so on. So lots of distilleries were sort of founded and then disappeared. But yeah, it did persist after that date. Yes.
Abby, time is passing on. Well, I'll pass that point over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for some really stimulating questions there to further our discussion. But yes, I agree with Ian. It's time to bring things to a close. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along and for posing such interesting questions. And thank you particularly to Darroch for all the time and effort you put into preparing for this very, very interesting talk. So great to see everyone again on the 9th. Of November, where Alison Chand will be bringing us up to date with our history into the 21st century, looking at parenting in the pandemic. So thanks very much to everyone, and we'll see you then. Bye.
Thank you very, very much.